Well, good afternoon, everyone. Annie, I really appreciate your courage to get up and speak of the goodness of Christ. And so that was a blessing to me. Thank you for taking the time to do that. So as we drove in today, my wife turned to me and said, "Do you miss coming down to Texas?" And I said, "Yeah, I kind of do miss it." See, for many years, I would come down here on almost a monthly basis, and I got the opportunity to work on large industrial projects along the Gulf Coast. And there's something exhilarating about conceptualizing something in your mind with a team and walking through a swamp in Louisiana or East Texas and visualizing the creation of a new industrial facility. World-class industrial facilities that may take 5-10 years to build, lots of cranes. There's definitely some excitement about that. And as I drove in, I was like, yeah, I kind of do miss that, being part of a team, building something big and doing something that felt significant. And as I reached into transition to do something different, large industrial facilities on the Gulf Coast comes at a cost. And so there is a mixed feeling. So today, a retirement or so this message was inspired by a conversation I had with my oldest son about a week and a half ago. And he said, "Dad, I don't feel like I know you that well. You haven't spent time with me explaining your childhood and how you were brought up. I know more about some of my friends' dads than I know about you, and I wish that you would have shared with me a little bit more about your past." And that is an artifact a little bit of spending time investing in these new facilities that are being built here in Texas and Louisiana and not being present. So I started reflecting a little bit about why I hadn't spent as much time sharing my story with my son. And what I heard in my soul was a story that I also heard from my mother-in-law. And she oftentimes says, "You know what, I just don't know what I have to offer to my grandkids. The stories that I have within me, I sort of humbly hold, and I'm not sure how impactful or important they are to share with my grandkids." And I guess I held a little bit of that in my heart too. I was like, my past, what do I have to really share with my son and my daughter and my family? And it's sort of a false humility, I think, that we carry with us. But I think it's really important. I think there's a call that the Lord has placed upon all of us to share. And the reason I say this is that God is in this world as a long-term player, and we're here for the short term. We're here for our lifespan, and the Lord is here for generations. See, the Lord that we worship is the Lord of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. He's interested in the long play, not the short play of our lives. And so as we entered into the spring holy days, in Exodus it started talking about, "See, I brought you out of the land of Egypt, and I delivered you from the king of Egypt, and I destroyed the most mighty armies. And I did all these amazing things to bring you out of slavery. And when you assemble yourselves during the Passover, remember to tell the next generation." See, the Lord was very interested in proclaiming to the generation to come of his goodness. So that's in Exodus 12, but then we go to Leviticus 23. In Leviticus 23, there's another request from the Lord, 23:42, and it says, "You shall dwell in booths for 7 days." So now we're not talking about the festival that we just completed. Now we're talking about the festival to come. And it says, All native Israelites shall dwell in booths, that your generations may know that I made the people of Israel dwell in booths when I brought them out of the land of Egypt. I am the Lord your God. See, both in Exodus 12 and Leviticus 23, the Lord is extolling us. Listen, you need to tell the story to the next generation. You need to take the testimony of what God has done in your life, and you need to share it on. And oftentimes we think of this as a responsibility of parents, but this is not necessarily just a direction to parents. This extends far beyond parents. So we go to Deuteronomy 4:9. We're going to spend a lot of time just sort of walking through the Bible here. In Deuteronomy 4:9, it says, only take care and keep your soul diligently, lest you forget the things that your eyes have seen, unless they depart from your heart all the days of your life. Make them known to your children and your children's children. See, the Lord was not going to let us off retiring from parenthood. See, we did all these amazing things. We raised kids, we built something, and it's amazing to see the kids grow up. But we really don't retire. The Lord asks us to enter into a different phase where he says, tell your children's children. And so the Lord is giving us clear direction that we are to tell his goodness to our children and our children's children. Now, when Joshua came across the Jordan River, the Lord asked him to take people from the tribes and send them back into the Jordan and collect stones. And those stones they were to place on top of a hill so that in future generations there would be no question about what the Lord had done. He had delivered them out of the hand of Egypt, and he had brought them across the Jordan River, and he separated the waters of the Jordan just like he had done in Egypt in the Red Sea. And the Lord knew that we had a tendency to forget and emphasize the goodness in our lives. We have questions and say, what we've experienced does the next generation value? Should we share our stories with the next generation? And the Lord knew that we had a tendency to say, now, the next generation has their own stories, they have their own things, and what can I possibly bring to the next generation of any value? So we minimize our life experiences, and therefore we hold back. And I believe this is exactly what Joshua and the elders of Israel suffered from also, because they had this great testimony of the Lord parting the Red Sea, parting the Jordan, feeding them, doing all of these amazing things. But I don't think they really followed through. And I'm encouraging you today not to take the same path that generation that came out of Egypt did, and not tell the next generation, because the peril of not doing it is significant and real. So we go to Judges right after we read about what Joshua did. And in Judges, it talks about the consequences of not telling the next generation, whether you're a parent or a grandparent, about the good things that God has done. So we'll start in Judges 2, verse 6. When Joshua dismissed the people of Israel went each to his inheritance to take possession of the land. And the people served the Lord all the days of Joshua and all the days of the elders who outlived Joshua, who had seen all the great works that the Lord had done for Israel. And Joshua, the son of Nun, the servant of the Lord, died at age 110 years. And they buried him within the boundaries of his inheritance at Timnath-Heres in the hill country of Ephraim, north of the mountain of Gash. And all their generations also were gathered to their fathers. And there arose another generation after them who did not know the Lord or the works that he had done for Israel. And so we're not that far removed. We're talking about grandparents and great-grandparents passing away. And now we have a generation that says they did not know what the Lord had done. And the people of Israel did what was evil in the sight of the Lord and served the Baals. And they abandoned the Lord, the God of their fathers, who had brought them out of the land of Egypt. They went after other gods from among the gods of the people who were around them and bowed down to them. And they provoked the Lord to anger. They abandoned the Lord and served the Baals and the Asherah. So the anger of the Lord was kindled against Israel, and he gave them over to the plunderers who plundered them, and he sold them into the hand of the surrounding enemies, so that they could no longer withstand their enemies. Whenever they marched out, the hand of the Lord was against them for harm, as the Lord had warned, and as the Lord has sworn to them, and they were in terrible distress. See, if anyone had testimonies of what the Lord had done, it should have been the generation of Joshua and the elders that were gathered together. But there was no linkage. The linkage was broken at that point, and the people went astray. And I really believe a lot of that was attributed to not passing along the testimony and reminding their children and grandchildren of the great things that the Lord had done. And so we've gone from a position where you have a generation of promises, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, where they had gone into slavery, and the Lord brought them out with a mighty hand. And the Lord says, remember the mighty works that I have done for you as I have brought you out. And we see one generation pass and another generation that says, I don't know. I never knew the Lord. And I believe that linkage was the failure to share our testimonies with our grandkids and our kids. And so when we get to David in Psalms, he is really doubling down and saying, listen, let's not repeat those same errors. Let's make sure that we are diligent to teach our testimony to the next generation. So in Psalms 145, we see David telling us how we should share our testimony with the next generations. Psalms 145. So in Psalms 145, David uses a series of verbs to tell us, I believe, on how to share our testimony with the next generation. So Psalms 145, beginning in verse 4. Actually, I'll back up to verse 3. He says, great is the Lord and greatly to be praised, and his greatness is unsearchable. So here you have David praising and worshiping God. And he says, one generation shall commend your works to another, and shall declare your mighty acts. On the glorious splendor of your majesty and on your wondrous works I will meditate. They shall speak of the might of your awesome deeds, and I will declare your greatness. They shall pour forth the fame of your abundant goodness, and will sing aloud of your righteousness. Now, I am not a grammar person, but I can pick out the verbs in that sentence. And so the words that come to mind are commend, declare, meditate, speak, declare, pour forth, and sing. So the Lord is calling us to active. These are active verbs. It is something that we go out and we practice. You don't sing passively. You don't commend. You don't declare. And the Lord is saying specifically in this verse, it says, one generation shall commend your works to another. And my question for you, are you taking up the Lord's decree? Have you retired, or are you still actively building something even more important than when you started? Are you taking seriously the Lord's request that you take the good testimonies and you pass them on from one generation to another generation? David continues to double down on this concept. We'll go back here a couple chapters to Psalm 78. And if I'm squinting up here, it's because I'm old and I need my glasses and I forgot them. But we can still proclaim his goodness. This is Psalm 78. We'll begin in verse 1, and the title of this is Tell the Coming Generation. Give ear, O my people, to my teachings. Incline your ear to the words of my mouth. I will open my mouth in a parable. I will utter dark sayings from of old, things that we have heard and known, that our fathers have told us. We will not hide them from our children, but we will tell to the coming generations the glorious deeds of the Lord in his might and the wonders that he has done. He has established a testimony in Jacob and appointed a law in Israel, which he commanded our fathers to teach to their children, that the next generation might know them, the children yet unknown. And arise and tell them to their children, so that they should set their hope in God and not forget the works of God, but keep his commandments. And that they should not be like their fathers, a stubborn and rebellious generation, a generation whose heart was not steadfast, whose spirit was not faithful to God. So I ask you, will you be faithful to the next generation? Will you be faithful to the God that has done amazing and marvelous works in your life? Will you take seriously the commission that he is giving you to build something even bigger and greater with the rest of your life? Psalm 71, starting in 17. Psalm 71, starting in verse 17. O God, from my youth you have taught me, and I still proclaim your wondrous deeds. So even to old age and gray hairs, O God, do not forsake me until I proclaim your might to another generation, your power to all those to come. See, the Lord doesn't ask us when our hairs turn gray to sit back, but to really lean in and proclaim it to the next generation. So the Barna Group did a study on spiritual formation within the family. And the spiritual formation, how does that occur in the next generation? And the Barna Group, after surveying a number of people, came to the conclusion that about 90% of our spiritual formation originates from our family of origin, and 10% comes from your church. Now, within the family component, the 90% of where spiritual formation comes, the most influence comes from parents. So hands down, your spiritual formation is a result of what your parents invested in your life, not what the church did, but what the parents did. And the second factor are grandparents. Grandparents are the second most influential component to a child's spiritual development after parents. What's interesting is that of Christian grandparents, only 25% of those people surveyed felt that discipleship of their grandchildren was the number one priority. 75% thought other factors were more important. A lot of that related to cultural relevance. Grandparents showing up at birthdays, grandparents coming to sporting events, getting together for holidays. That was sort of the focus. I'll be there for my grandkids to go and support them, take them on vacations, which is very important. I don't want to diminish that component of investing in your grandkids' life from a cultural perspective. But it was interesting that the second most influential group in a child's life, the grandparents, thought that discipleship of their kids into Christianity was not the first priority, but was a secondary priority. And so for me, I have mourned that my kids have not had their grandparents speak into their lives as I had grandparents speak into my life. And I think that to a large extent, I've mourned that because I recognize how important it is for grandparents to be present in the lives of their grandchildren. And so in my life, there were two people that had a significant impact on my life. I had a great-granddad that had a tremendous amount of impact on my life, and I had a granddad. One of them was on my father's side, and one of them was on my mother's side. And I just use them as an example to show how much they can influence a person's life and where they're going. So one of my grandparents, actually I'll start with both of them. Both of my granddads, my great-granddad and my granddad grew up in farming communities. One grew up in Waterman, Illinois, which is a small suburb outside of Chicago, about 40 minutes. And he was born to a family. His father was a mechanic, and his mother was a librarian. My great-granddad was born in Colorado into a ranching community. And they have stories about coming out of Utah into western Colorado and living in a log cabin with a dirt roof. And when it would rain, the dirt would come and wash off the roof, and they would sleep in beds that were red because all the dirt and mud would come into the house. So neither one of the families came from a very affluent background, and they both came out of agrarian type of situations. So on my father's side, when he was growing up, his dad had come over from Colorado Springs, and he was in an argument with a neighbor. At that time, my great-granddad was about 8 years old, and he was riding on the back of a horse with my great-granddad, and the neighbors had had a dispute over water, and he got in a fight with the neighbor, and they pulled out guns, and my great-great-granddad got shot in front of my great-granddad and passed away. So he came out of some trauma in his life. They talk about him running back and crawling underneath a bed and trying to get him out for days as he mourned the loss of his dad. At that point, he took on a name of Sally because his mom now had all these kids and didn't have a father. And so he was stuck with cooking. So his name became known as Sally. And so he grew up in that type of environment, cooking. And then eventually he began entering into the family business of ranching. In the first ranch he bought, you had to go about 11 miles from this little tiny community and then get on a horse and ride another 4 miles to their house. And he married in 1920s, and he bought his first car in 1948. He was a gentleman, as I was young, that I saw as being really old. He lived in a small house out where you had to have a four-wheel drive to go down into this valley, across this river, back up. If it rained, you couldn't get to them. I knew them all the way through high school. When he was present, you had a lot of respect. You knew that there was somebody of a lot of dignity, a lot of authority, a lot of wisdom. He always showed interest in us grandkids. He was very engaged in our lives. He also had a Bible with him. And so while he didn't explicitly preach to us about the Bible, we knew that he valued the Bible and it was important. And he passed on that biblical passion to my grandmother, who passed it on to my dad. So there was this cascade of the value of the Bible that originated in him. And so while he didn't live in big houses or other things like that, he left a legacy to me that was really impactful. And today my oldest son, his name is Weston, and he holds the name of my great-granddad because of the influence he had on my life and the legacy he left behind for me. So this contrasts a bit against my other granddad, who was very influential in my life. See, my other granddad had a rich relative that had married into a family in Chicago that owned a company that made leather. And so they made leather, bridles, and saddles, and they outfitted the U.S. military during World War I, and they sold that, and they used to travel between Chicago and go out to Wyoming. And as they had passed through, they always met with my granddad, who was a little kid and influenced him, and they encouraged him to go to college. And so he went off to college and got a degree at the University of Illinois, which is where my alma mater is. I followed in my granddad's steps. And he got a degree in journalism. And I always loved going to my granddad because my granddad always was very patient. He was always very engaged in my life. and I love my granddad tremendously, and I looked up to him. See, when we would go and visit him, it was a big contrast to my granddad out in Colorado. See, my granddad in Chicago would always arrange for us to go see the Cubs. And I loved watching the Cubs play baseball. And we always had great seats. We always had seats right behind home plate. And there were always really interesting people that sat near us. I remember the governor of Illinois sitting next to us, and he would come up and say, "Hi, Clayton, how are you doing?" And I was always amazed that the governor would know my granddad. See, my granddad ran the company that owned the Chicago Cubs, and he lived in a huge house, and he knew all the most important people, and he would go golfing with President Ford and Nixon. And when Nixon got into the Watergate crisis, my granddad called him and said, "It's time to resign," and he listened to him, and he resigned. And he had a lot of influence. But the difference between my granddad on my dad's side and my granddad on my mom's side is that my granddad on my mom's side said, "I'm a paid-up church member, so I've paid into the church, but I don't go and I don't really value it that much." At least that's how it felt to me. See, he was building amazing things like I was building on the Gulf Coast. He was building these really amazing things that people in this world respect, but he wasn't leaving the legacy of a Bible to his grandkids. And when I look at my parents, my mom specifically, and my aunts and uncles, for the most part, they're all shipwrecked. They are devoid of a hope in a bigger thing. Hope in a coming kingdom of God that on my dad's side was a legacy that was passed through. See, on my mom's side, my grandparents were engaged on a cultural basis. They were coming to the birthday parties, they were taking us on trips, they were doing all the good things that a grandparent should. But there was tremendous distress, just like in Judges, where it said the next generation didn't know. Because at some point on my mom's side, there was a religious value, value in a relationship with Christ that was good Methodist. But on this side, there was a lot of value on the Bible and the value of the Bible, and that continued to travel down, and eventually it came to me. See, when Barna did the study, it got people thinking about how do we pass on the next generation the goodness of God. And so the Legacy Coalition was set up to sort of study where are grandparents in the lives of their grandkids. And what they found is that there's 4 places that people fall in. They fall in a Christian perspective, a cultural perspective, a blocked perspective, or I feel like I'm not equipped. So as grandparents are approaching their grandkids, they say, I value my relationship with Jesus Christ, and I'm going to share it with my grandkids. Or, I value the cultural relationship that I have with my grandkids, and that is what I'm sharing. Or they feel blocked. So they feel blocked because they don't have a good relationship with their kids, or they don't feel like their grandkids care. Or the last position they find themselves is in a position of being unequipped. How do I disciple a next generation? And so, even though on my dad's side there was this legacy of Christianity that was flowing down, I believe that my grandmother and others felt blocked. They valued Christianity, but they felt blocked because we belong to a different type of religion. Our practices look different. We went to church on Saturday and they went on Sunday. But despite feeling blocked, they still passed on to the next generation the value that a relationship with Christ and the value of the Bible was important. And I mention this because many of you may feel blocked. Many of you may feel blocked for the same reason, because of different religious ideologies, because of relationships. And I'm telling you, you don't have to do it by preaching in an overt way. What you need to do is set a proper example like my granddad did, where I knew that he valued the Bible. He would not come at me and tell me this is what you have to believe. But he set an amazing example for me, my grandmother, my dad, and myself. And so even if you can't disciple as you might envision, being present, seeing your grandkids for who they are is really important. See, this last week I was in class and I was really shocked. We were sitting there and I was getting ready for the final, and one of the students raised her hand and said, "Mr. Foy, can we have a 2-day final?" And I said, "You are crazy. Why would you want a 2-day final when I'll just give a 1-day final?" And she said, "I don't know. It just seemed like it was a good idea that we would do a 2-day final." And I said, "Bree, I can make the final much longer, but I don't think that's what you want." And so I started making a joke about it. I said, "Now, Bree wants a 2-day final. Who in class thinks we should do a 2-day final?" And everybody's like, "No, we don't want a 2-day final." And I said, "Jewel always says that she wants math on the problems. Who wants me to put a lot of math on the science test?" Not me. And so I started doing this joke about like, all right, so-and-so likes math, so-and-so likes long finals. And then the kids started raising their hands and said, "Mr. Foy, tell me what I like." And I said, "You like to play volleyball." "Mr. Foy, what do I like to do?" And I would say, "You're an amazing soccer player." And the whole class just had their hands. This is 8th graders. They're all raising their hands saying, "Mr. Foy, what do I like to do?" Because what they wanted is they wanted to be seen and they wanted to be understood. And so parents have a unique opportunity to see their kids and to understand them. But I would say even more so, grandparents have the opportunity to see and to understand their children. You have a unique opportunity to speak into your grandkids' lives because they want to be seen, they want to be understood by you. And if you're taking your relationship with Christ along with you, as you see, you can have a tremendous influence upon their lives. So we saw something very similar in 2 Timothy. In 2 Timothy 1:5, Paul was talking to Timothy, and he said, "I saw the faith that resided within your grandmother and within your mother, and it now resides within you." See, there is a stream that is passing down from generation to generation. And thank goodness the Lord in his wisdom gave us 6 adults involved in our lives. We have 2 parents and 4 grandparents. So if one side isn't having the flow of a relationship with Christ flowing into the next generation, there's another opportunity with other parents flowing down. And so for some of you, you may be the only opportunity that your grandkids have to hear about Jesus and testify of his goodness and of the Father and his goodness and how he delivered his people. And so I would encourage you that as you start interacting with your grandkids and your great-grandkids, that you would realize that you are building something bigger than maybe you built in the first phase of your life. See, in the first phase of my life in Texas, I was building into infrastructure. And now when I come, I'm like, oh man, maybe I've stepped back. But in reality, it's almost like a promotion. I now have the opportunity to speak into my son's life, my daughter's life, my other son's life, and God willing, my grandkids' lives. Because God is not a God of a single generation. He is into multi-generational blessings that pass down from generation to generation because he knows the consequences of not sharing it. If you don't share your testimony with your grandkids, who's going to? Don't let their faith become extinguished like it happened as Joshua and the elders passed away, that there would be another generation that wouldn't remember. Because there's 30 million Christian grandparents in this country. If all of them would disciple 4 kids, their 4 grandkids, we could have revival within this nation. So it is a force to be reckoned with, and the Lord is asking us to do that. So as Daniel was concluding at the end of his book, he spoke to this. So Daniel 12 is where I'm going to conclude. Daniel 12. In Daniel 12:1, we start seeing this world disappearing and another world beginning to emerge, to come out of the ground, and to become more of a prevalent force within our known world. At that time shall arise Michael, the great prince who has charge of the people, and there shall be a time of trouble, such as never been since there was a nation until that time. But at that time your people shall be delivered, everyone whose name shall be found written in the book. And many of those who sleep in the dust of the earth shall awake, some to everlasting life, and some to shame and everlasting contempt. And those who are wise shall shine like the brightness of the sky above, and those who turn many to righteousness like the stars forever and ever. I believe the Lord is calling us to be wise and to share our testimony, that we may be, that our greatness and the greatness of the light, not our greatness, but our brightness may shine to the generations forever. So as you consider this walk and your grandkids and your great-grandkids, if God gives it to you, that your time is not over. And as parents, recognize that your parents have the opportunity to complete an amazing work in your kids. So with that, may your brightness shine for generations and generations to come.